power of sin and darkness, whose love is mighty and so much stronger, the King of glory, the King above all kings, who shakes the whole earth with holy thunder, who releases breathless in awe and wonder, the King of glory, the King above all kings. This is amazing grace. This is unfailing love, that you would take my place, that you would bear my cross. You laid down your life, that I would be set free. Oh, Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. Who brings our chaos back into order? Who makes the orphan a son and daughter? The King of glory, the King of glory, who rules the nations with truth and justice, shines like the sun in all of his brilliance. The King of glory, the King above all kings. Yeah, this is amazing grace. This is unfailing love, that you would take my place, that you would bear my cross. You laid down your life, that I would be set free. Oh, Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy, worthy, worthy. Yeah, this is amazing grace. This is unfailing love, that you would take my place, that you would bear my cross. You laid down your life, that I would be set free. Oh, Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. Let me try that again. That's not right. Hold on. Let me start. Sorry.
Let the King All right. Well, good morning, Tribe Church. We are so excited to have you with us today, here from our living room to your living room. It's really a great thing that I think we're all coming together during this time that we're continuing to meet. One of the things that I want to tell you is that our marriage conference has not been canceled. It has been postponed. We still have every intention of doing the marriage conference, and probably even bigger and better than we would have if we'd been able to do it yesterday, March 21st. But it is not canceled. It is postponed. The other thing I want to talk to you about is Tribe Together. Tribe Together is our, after our service, we offer a class called Tribe Together. And it's just a time to come, hang out with Matt and I, and find out what a tribe is all about. If you're watching this and you're like, man, I want to be a part of what that church is doing, go ahead and text the number that's on your screen right now, and you can go through the Tribe Together with Matt and I. We'll do it through Google Hangouts or through Zoom or through FaceTime or something like that, but we would love to still connect with you. And speaking of connection, if this whole thing has made you realize that you are ready to take that next step of faith, we're still going to offer baptism. How are we going to do it? I don't know. But if somebody wants to get baptized, you text this number at any time. Text the word baptism to this number at any time, and we're going to get you baptized. We'll figure it out. I have 100% confidence that between the amazing team of volunteers that we have at Tribe, we can get you baptized. So if that's something you're interested in, text this number on the screen right now. The next thing I have for you is your Social 30. So this is going to look a little different than it does on a normal Sunday morning, but right now I want you to text the number, or not text the number on your screen. I want you to text someone. I want you to call someone. I want you to Facebook message someone from our congregation, and I want you to just say, hey, I'm watching the video right now, I'm watching Tribe right now, I'm watching the live stream right now, whatever it is. It doesn't matter when you do this, just reach out to somebody and say, hey, I am with you, I am here for you. Do that right now. You've got 30 seconds. So this sermon today might be just a little bit long. I just kind of want to warn you of that in the very beginning, that this is, even if we had been meeting in church today, the chances of me going long were good, because there is so much important content that needs to be presented this morning. So I just want to warn you of that. Normally we are like a good 35 minutes. This may go like as long as 40. So know that if that does happen, Matt is somewhere behind this camera right now, just literally dying. Okay, so just keep that in mind. But I think it's going to be a really good one today. Today we're going to talk about the most powerful leadership principle on the planet. Every leader that you know and that you have respect for practices this principle, and every leader that you don't have respect for does not practice this principle. You can lead without it, but any leader worth following is going to practice this principle. And this extraordinary concept was actually explains how the first century Jewish cult, following a crucified leader who had no military, had no territory, no authority, no sacred texts at that time, not only survived through the first, second, and third century, but was actually embraced by the very culture that tried to eradicate it. Throughout this series, we've said over and over again that Jesus came to the world to create something brand new to the world and for the world. And that included authority and leadership, the way that that was run in the world. And the best ways, and in the very best ways to lead, were changed by Jesus as well. We've seen some stuff from our leaders this week, haven't we? The situation like the one that we're facing with COVID-19 really shows us who our leaders are as people, what they truly care about. And we have opinions on this. I think we have some big opinions on this. When your boss says, slow down, focus on your family, stay home, stay away from people, you think, wow, this is going really well. He or she is probably a really good leader. But when your boss says, we need to focus on work right now, and you need to be coming in to the office, when we've been told to socially distance ourselves, you're going to think something very different. And obviously this doesn't apply to healthcare workers. If you're a healthcare worker, we just want to say thank you for what you're doing during this time. We know that we are all relying on you, and we're thankful for the time that you are giving for to keep our nation safe. You are the front line of defense, and we see that, and we know that this is hard. But what I'm here to tell you is that your opinions of how your boss or our local government or our national government is handling this COVID-19 pandemic has been influenced by the power and the presence of Jesus. And not because he's here in this living room today watching this message, even though he is. And while we're on that subject real quick, Jesus is every bit as comfortable and accessible in your own home as he is in any brick and mortar church building in the world. You may, if you learn nothing else from this experience, learn that you do not have to be, the church is so much more than just a building. The church is the people. But going back to this idea, Jesus is with us all the time. Yes, that is true. But what I am here to tell you is that his actions here on earth 2,000 years ago have influenced the way that we still think about leaders today. Because you see, before Jesus came into the world, every kingdom, every business, everything was all run the same way, top down. But what Jesus started would actually be upside down. And where the least of these is what matters most, where leaders eat last, where the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Back to our story. Jesus performed a lot of miracles during his ministry, but he didn't call him miracles, and I don't really think we should call them miracles either. The people at the time didn't call them miracles, they actually called them signs. And I think it's sometimes easy to get caught up in all the stuff that Jesus was doing here on earth and miss the fact that each one of the things that he did was carefully chosen for that time and place. He wasn't just performing miracles at random. He was performing signs. And a sign isn't something random. A sign points to something. A sign points to something. And probably the most disruptive sign, the sign that caused the most trouble in the ancient world was that Jesus performed when he was here, was when he raised Lazarus from the dead. If you've been part of church at any time in your life, you've probably heard the story of Lazarus. Lazarus was from the same town as Mary, like washed Jesus' feet with her perfume and her own hair, Mary, that Mary. And Martha, like Jesus, tell my sister to get off her rump and come help me in the kitchen, like that Martha. He was the brother of those two. And if you were alive at Jesus' time, you probably would have heard of Lazarus too, because Lazarus was well known in the city of Bethany. He was well known in the city of Bethany. And outside the city of Bethany, he was known there too. But that wasn't what made Lazarus so famous. What made Lazarus so famous was that Lazarus wasn't just dead. He was like dead. Like he was already embalmed and entombed. They had already had the funeral dead. They had already hired the mourners dead, because little known fact, they used to hire people to sort of weep and wail at the funerals. I've instructed Matt Dilley to do the same thing at my funeral. There was, actually no, he has a whole plan for that. There was, this wasn't some, well, maybe she wasn't really dead when Jesus raised her up. Maybe she was just like mostly dead, but slightly alive. Like, it wasn't something like that. This was all dead. And anybody who's seen The Princess Bride knows that there's only one thing you can do if they're all dead. Go through their clothes and look for loose change. And Lazarus, that dude was all dead. One of the most incredible stories in the New Testament is that Jesus, and this is one of the most incredible stories in the New Testament, because Jesus and his disciples get word from Mary and Martha that Lazarus, who they describe as the one Jesus loved, was really sick. And the disciples are all like, all right, let's go to Bethany, because surely you are going to heal your friend. And Jesus is like, sit down. We're not going anywhere. And as we know, eventually Lazarus does die. And Jesus shows up at the end of the funeral, when Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. And in fact, when they finally, he goes to Mary and Martha first, and then they have to go to the tomb. And he says to open the tomb. And Martha says, but Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there will be a bad odor, because he had been in there for 4 days. He is so bad that his body would have already started to decay and to smell. But just like Peter did, what we found a couple weeks ago, because Jesus said to do it, they sort of let down their metaphorical nets and they open the door to this tomb. And they remove the stone, and Jesus calls out to Lazarus, and the dead man walked out of the tomb. And this makes Lazarus a local celebrity. In fact, the city of Bethlehem actually becomes like a tourist attraction, because people start flocking to it, hoping for a Lazarus sighting. Word begins to spread wide of what Jesus has done. And in fact, some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. And the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. Okay? Now the Sanhedrin, they were like the temple leaders in Jerusalem. So Bethany is near Jerusalem, but it's not the same as Jerusalem. Think like Greenwood in Indianapolis or Plainfield in Indianapolis, okay? And the Sanhedrin were like the Supreme Court. Pastor Matt preached about the Sanhedrin, one of the Sanhedrin last week. He preached about Nicodemus. And if you haven't seen that yet, stop this right now. Go back, watch his sermon. In fact, if you're not all the way caught up, this is sermon number 7 in our 10-part series. These are like antibiotics, guys. You got to take all of them. You don't necessarily have to do them all in order, but you got to take all of them. I think it is so important. I think this is the most important series we've ever preached at Tribe, and you've got time now. You need to make sure that you are caught up on this series. You definitely want to do that before Easter. So Nicodemus was at this meeting, and here's what they conclude at this meeting of the Sanhedrin. They say, what are we accomplished? Here is this man performing many signs. Remember, these weren't just random miracles. These were signs, and a sign points to something. And what Jesus was pointing to was something brand new. And the Sanhedrin would have had a problem with this, because if something new is coming, maybe we don't need them anymore. And so they have concerns about their job security. They're like, we have to put a stop to this. And it goes on and it says, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. And remember, guys, the temple was huge for them. This was an incredibly important part of their faith. They loved their temple. And what Jesus is introducing is radically new. If everybody is going to follow Jesus, they're not going to follow or need that Sanhedrin anymore, and they're not going to need the temple anymore, okay? And I have said many times throughout this series that we are on the wrong side of history, and it causes us to miss things, because Jesus came to replace everything that was in place. And even now, over 2,000 years later, we sometimes have the tendency to hang on to what Jesus came to replace. The text goes on here to say, so from that day on, they, and that means the Sanhedrin, plotted to take his life. Because how do you stop a movement? You have to cut off the head. And so Jesus finds out about this. And the writers of the Gospels don't tell us how Jesus found out about this. But let's see if we can kind of take what we've learned here and put two and two together. Nicodemus was part of the Sanhedrin. Nicodemus sought out Jesus at night to learn from his teachings. And so maybe Nicodemus was the one who told him, hey, they are out to get you. They are going to take your life if you don't watch it, if you don't stop this. And maybe that didn't happen at all. I don't know. But we do know that Jesus knew that there was a plot to take his life. And so therefore, Jesus no longer moved publicly among the people of Judea. Judea is the region where the temple is. And it would have been really easy for him to just head north to Galilee, to head home, essentially. But Passover was coming up, and Jesus wanted to celebrate Passover in the city of Jerusalem. So he stays covertly in the city, and because there are spies all over the city trying to get information about where Jesus was and what he was doing so that they could get that information back to the Sanhedrin so that they could arrest him and stop his movement. And during this time, Jesus is sort of wandering around the area, and he ends up back at Bethany. And our text says this: a large crowd, we've gone from a crowd to a large crowd of Jews, found out that Jesus was there and came to him, not because of him, but also to see Lazarus. Remember I said he was a tourist attraction, whom he had raised from the dead. So now you've got Jesus and Lazarus in the same city. It's a double whammy. So a large crowd comes to see him. And so listen to how desperate this goes on. So this is verse 9. Look at verse 10. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. Why are they doing that? Why are they doing that? Because when he raised Lazarus, that was a miracle, right? No, that was a sign. And a sign points to something. Because Lazarus was evidence of Jesus' power and authority here on earth. This was unlike anything they had ever seen before. This was brand new. And so, look at this, look at the next verse. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well, for on account of him, many Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. It's worth noting here that the first century Christianity was not about believing in belief. I think sometimes we get caught up on this because we're on the wrong side of history. It wasn't the Bible says it, so I believe it, and that settles it, because they had no Bible. They believed in what they saw with their eyes, and they wanted to see Lazarus, so they sought him out because he was living proof. He was dead, and now he's literally walking around. The first century Christianity is an evidence-based belief system. And some of you out there listening to this message, maybe you're in the kitchen while somebody's watching it in the living room, and you're like, yeah, whatever, that's church. I don't do that. Maybe you stepped away from faith because the version of faith that you grew up on was one where you had faith you had to have faith in faith, where you checked your mind at the door, where you checked your intellect at the door, where you checked your science at the door, and you just had to believe in faith. But that is not what first century Christianity was about. It was evidence-based, and the reason that people began to follow Jesus was not because of faith. It was because of what they saw. Because you became, and still today, you become a Christian by faith, but you don't have to become a Christian because of faith. You become a Christian by faith, but you don't have to become a Christian because of faith. You can look at the proof that we have throughout this text. The text goes on to say, the next day, another great crowd, had come to the festival, and they heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. So he's starting to take the walk that is going to take him to Jerusalem. And everybody is talking about Jesus. The festival this verse is referring to is Passover. And people were maybe even more excited about seeing Jesus than they were about Passover. So the Pharisees said to one another, "See, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him." It says that in John 12:19. And they had no idea, right? The world was so much bigger than they could have ever imagined. And 2,000 years later, we are still talking about this man and his movement. We are still following after him. They meant it hyperbolically, but the whole world has in fact gone after him. I have seen so many posts of prayers and Bible verses and worship songs as a way of comforting ourselves and comforting others throughout this whole COVID-19 thing. I think the world, when the chips fall down, we still seek after this man who lived 2,000 years ago. So the stage is set. There are people inside the city of Jerusalem, and they're waiting for Jesus. There are people outside the city of Jerusalem, and they're walking with Jesus. Passover is getting closer. Tensions are getting higher. There's increased military presence because Passover tended to be a time when people could get a little bit rowdy. And there are a lot more people in the city as usual. There are a lot more people in the city than usual. And Jerusalem was a really large city by ancient standards. There were thousands and thousands of people streaming into the city of Jerusalem in order to celebrate Passover there. And Jesus and his guys are making their way to Jerusalem for the same reason. They want to celebrate Passover in the city of Jerusalem. They're part of this crowd that is walking, and just imagine this huge crowd of people like walking together towards the city. I know it's hard to imagine a large crowd of people, even a small crowd of people, doing anything right now. But Jesus and his disciples are a part of this crowd. And we're going to head away from, where were we in John? Yeah, John. And we're going to head over to Mark. So they're on their way up to Jerusalem, and Jesus is leading the way. And I love, this is Mark 10:32, and I love the next word, because the next word is again. Look at that word again. We talked about the last time that I preached that a lot of these sermons and statements that Jesus is recorded as having said were things that he said over and over and over again. That's why we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, texts written by different people at different times in history. I guess what I'm saying is they didn't all sit around a table and all, it's not like a classroom where they're all writing an essay on the same thing at the same time. They had different levels of intelligence, different levels of intellect, and yet they all have very, very similar stories. Sometimes when you're reading through the Gospels, which you should be doing as part of our 90 initiative on YouVersion, you can read through the Bible with us, through the Gospels with us. It's not too late to start that. In fact, you might have a lot of extra time on your hands where you can get through those Gospels really quick right now. But he says the same thing over and over again. And because Jesus was a great teacher, and great teachers know that you have to do a lot of repeating. And now all you moms and dads out there who are serving as your child's teacher right now, you're going to find this to be true too. You got to say things over and over and over again. So this is something that Jesus has told these guys before. And if you're reading through the Gospels and you find them to be repetitive, take comfort in that, because it means that they're accurate, okay? So he took the 12 aside and he told them what was going to happen to him. They're on the road with these people, and people are asking questions. They're coming up to Jesus. They're trying to get close to the disciples. They're like, hey, Peter, tell me about walking on the water, all this other stuff. And Jesus decides to take a break. He pulls his guys off the road. And there are other people still heading towards Jerusalem, but Jesus and his fellows, maybe they sit under a tree, they're offside of the road, they're off on their own, and Jesus is going to have one last chat with them before they go into the city. They're going to go over the plan one more time before they actually get there. This is kind of like the equivalent to the talk that you have with your kids before you get to Disney World, where you're like, all right, guys, we're in the parking lot, okay? And you're like, we're going to go, and we're going to have to stand in line for a little bit. But it's going to be okay. The more patient you are, the quicker we're going to get through that line. And, you're going to put your finger on the little turnstile thing, and you're not going to put your finger on the little turnstile thing, and whatever. I'm like, remember, it's got to be the same finger. I'm like, and then we're going to go right to this ride. We're going to get on it. We're going to ride the rock and roller coaster. And it's going to be so much fun. This is kind of, he wasn't talking about going to Disney World. That's obviously way more fun than what Jesus is about to do. But it's kind of like that, where you're like, all right, one last time, we're going to go over the plan just so that everybody stays in line, okay? And he says, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. I told you, we're not going to Disney World. But I think you understand what I'm talking about, right? And he's telling them, they're after me. We are not hiding anymore. They'd kind of been laying low for a while, but this was about to come to an end. And it goes on to say, they will come and they will condemn him. He's talking in the third person here. They will condemn him to death, and hand me over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And 3 days later, he will rise. He's saying this to them again. He said it before, but he's saying it to them again. Have you ever told somebody something and it just goes right over their head? Like they don't even come close to understanding what you're trying to say. I remember when we were first married, I found this really cool recipe for Mexican lasagna. So I gathered all of the ingredients and I made it for dinner one night for my new husband. And I was pretty proud of my efforts, guys. I did not know at that time that I was not a cooker person. And for those of you who've never had Mexican lasagna, it's got the same bones as regular lasagna, but it's something new entirely. Instead of noodles, it uses tortillas. Instead of tomato sauce, it uses a salsa. Instead of sausage, it uses taco meat. Instead of mozzarella, it uses that taco blend cheese. And so this dish that we were gonna have for dinner was brand new. Matt had never had anything like it. I had never had anything like it. As far as my little 23-year-old self knew, the world had never seen anything like this before. And so Matt walks through the door after work and he says, "Wow, something smells good." And I said, "I made Mexican lasagna." And so we sit down to eat and he takes a few bites and I'm like, "Do you like it?" And he says, "I just don't understand what was wrong with regular lasagna." Right? You guys, I wasn't trying to improve on regular lasagna. Regular lasagna was as good as it was ever going to be. Like the plane has landed. Like I love regular lasagna, don't get me wrong, but this was... nothing I'm going to do to it is ever going to make somebody say, "Wow, this is different than anything we've ever had before." And my poor little 22-year-old husband, just right over the head. And it was years before we had Mexican lasagna again. I think that moment when someone totally misses what you're trying to say, that moment when you're just like, you roll your eyes, I think that's the moment that Jesus had with his disciples, because he pulls them aside to explain one more time that he is going to be mocked and ridiculed and beaten and killed, and that 3 days later he is going to rise. And listen to what the disciples say. Mark 10:35, it says, "Then," like right then. Like, then is a preposition which implies that this is different than, this is not again, this is something that happens, like I'm not just like writing this down in sections or whatever, like right then, as soon as Jesus has stopped talking, and it's like, okay, I'm gonna die, I'm gonna raise again 3 days later, it's all gonna be okay. Then James and John, the son of Zebedee, come to him and they say, "Teacher, we want for you to do for us whatever we ask." I just love this. Because you have to crack up at the boldness of this statement. It's like, Jesus, can we get a pre-commitment for you that you're going to do this thing for us that we want you to do without us actually telling you what that is? And kids, if you're listening right now, this strategy never works, ever. It never, ever works. And so Jesus, who is gracious and kind, far more gracious and kind than I will ever be, he says, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they say, "Let one of us sit at your right and one of us sit at your left in your glory." And then the other 10 disciples hear this and they become indignant. I think we have that. It says, yeah. When the other 10 hear that, they become indignant with James and John. But they're not like, "Hey, that's a terrible thing to say. Like, how dare you say this?" It's more like, "Hey, what about me? I'm Peter. I was the first follower. I'm the one who put the nets down." And Jesus, or Matthew, was being like, "Hey, I'm a tax collector. Like, I got all this money. Like, let me have that role." Or Judas is probably like, "Hey, you guys, I have more skin in the game than any of you could possibly imagine." Because they're all thinking, "Yeah, we've heard this whole thing about the spitting and the flogging and the dying and the whatnot, but when it's all over and you pull off some great miracle, some great sign, and we're all like, 'Oh, Jesus, whoa!' When all of that is over and you are sitting on your throne, we want to be right there next to you." And can you even decide which one of us is going to be number 2 and which one is going to be number 3? Like, you can decide that. We'll let you have that decision. But we want to have positions of authority in your new kingdom's organization. Because you remember that top-down thing we talked about at the beginning of this message? That is what they were talking about. When Jesus reorganizes this already existing infrastructure, they wanted to be at the top. And Jesus is so patient with these people. His shoulders don't sag like mine probably would have. He doesn't have to like hold his eyes in so they don't roll right out of his head like I sometimes do. Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. Because he knew that they were going to discover that glory was going to come before the glory. We're not going to go there for a couple of weeks. But here's a heads up. When Jesus is arrested, the disciples scatter while he's awaiting his trial. Some of them deny that they never even knew Jesus, probably because they were disappointed. They clearly had other things in mind when they pictured his glory. They were not picturing him, even though he told him he was going to be arrested and spit on and flogged and mocked and ridiculed. These were not the things that they thought were going to happen when they were on their way to Jerusalem. And I think part of the reason that the disciples missed the mark so badly here is because of the momentum that their movement had at this time in history. They had one crowd with them, they had another crowd waiting on them. Passover is coming. They were part of a movement that seemed unstoppable. And ladies and gentlemen, you were part of it. This time last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, you were part of a society that seemed unstoppable, and we have ground it to a halt. You know what this feels like. I think they thought Jesus was going to ascend to a throne right before their very eyes. Think about what those verses say. Can we sit next to you in your glory? I don't think they were asking to sit next to Jesus in heaven for all time. I think they were asking to sit next to Jesus on a throne in Jerusalem next week. That's what they're asking for. So after this whole who's going to sit on my right and left debacle, Jesus calls the 12 over again, and this is what he says. And if you're a follower of Jesus, this is for you. If you're a leader in your church like I am, this goes doubly for us. And if you're a person who left the faith, it's possible that it's because the Christians that you've interacted with missed this message that Jesus had for the 12. So listen to this. Jesus called them together and said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and the high officials exercise authority over them. He's saying, guys, you know how authority works. The person at the top has all of the power, has all of the control. The leverage flows up, and they use that leverage for their own benefit, regardless of what it means for the people underneath them. And the 12 are like, yeah, we know exactly how it works. That's why we're asking if we can be at the top of the pyramid. Because when you're at the top, you can leverage the people under you so that you can get what you want and you can get what you need. We know they knew exactly how that worked. And Jesus looks at them. And if you're a Christian, he's looking at you. If you're a leader in this church or your church or the church or whatever, he's looking at you. I know he's looking at me because I'm a pastor. And he says the most important words that have been spoken for people in leadership ever. He says, not so with you. And guys, this was brand new. There were no nonprofits at Jesus' time. There were no organizations that existed solely for the purpose of helping the less fortunate. Nothing like that existed. Jesus is saying that this top-down approach is not going to work in his kingdom. He says, if you're going to be a part of my movement, you have to get this right. Influence is not for the benefit of the powerful and the influential. In my movement, we are going to flip that upside down. The influence and power are going to be used for a different purpose entirely. He goes on to say, instead, whoever wants to be great among you must become your servant. And this must have hit his disciples like a ton of bricks because this was radical. This was brand new. The word servant to us is relative because we don't really have servants in central Indiana, and we definitely don't, or at least shouldn't, have slaves here in central Indiana. But these words would have hit the disciples like a sucker punch to the gut because they knew servants. Some of these guys had servants at one point in their life or another, and Jesus is telling them, if you want to be great in my movement, you have to become a servant. This means you have to go back to the back of the line. And the disciples are like, oh, Jesus, that stings a little. We don't want to go back to the back of the line. And then Jesus is like, well, yeah, well, listen to this. Whoever wants to be first must, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. Slaves were like the back of the line. And then he says this, for even the Son of Man, and that's what he calls himself here, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And we read that and we think of the crucifixion. But when they heard that for the first time, they didn't think of the crucifixion because it hadn't happened yet. This didn't make any sense. So he's telling them that he's going to die. He's going to give his life. And what do you think they thought when they heard this? Do you think they finally got it? We've been given such a unique opportunity over the next 6 weeks. You can use this time not just to be served, but also to serve. This might be the only time in our nation's history where eating from a local restaurant can be called service, can be an act of service. When the lawyer was trying to trick Jesus and he asked him, what is the greatest commandment, which is love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul. He says, what's the second greatest commandment? Do you remember what he said? Jesus replied, love your neighbor as yourself. And now is the time to do this. Like if you were looking for a miracle, if you were looking for a sign, this is it. If you have an elderly neighbor, maybe go to the grocery store for them. Wave at them through the window or put on a little play. Like do something for them. Act like you're going down a set of stairs, that one. Like bring a smile to their face. Put a little care package of toys that your kids have outgrown. Take them to a kid down the street. Maybe throw some Clorox wipes in there so that they can wipe them off before they play with them. How would the world look different if for the next 6 weeks we as Christians looked at this not as a time to hunker down, but a time to serve the literal people around us? What if you ask your spouse, what can I do for you today? And then you do it. And the same with your kids or your parents. Folks, we have been given the gift of time like no other group of humans in the modern age. Do not miss this opportunity to serve the people that Jesus told you to serve, your neighbors and your family. Jesus took away all your excuses when he said, I did not come to serve, I did not come to be served, but to serve. And COVID-19 has now given you the opportunity to put those words into practice. Jesus was the king who laid down his life for his subjects. And he doesn't ask us to lay down our lives for him, but he asks us to lay down our lives for one another. That's what he's asking you to do. In the book of Acts, which comes right after the 4 Gospels, one of the first problems they had in the early church was that Peter and the other disciples are so busy taking care of widows and orphans that they can't get them to take a break to teach the things that Jesus taught them. Think about that for a second. Like the disciples, this message that Jesus is telling them, they eventually get it. The people had to pry their fingers off the serving trays to get them to stop and teach a Bible study because they're like, listen, we know that you're trying to serve these widows and these orphans and we get it. That's a great thing to do. But we need you to tell us what Jesus told you because you're the only ones he said these things to. And they had a hard time not continually going to the back of the line in the early church. So they eventually get it. But I don't think they get it until the next day, when they finally get to Jerusalem. They finally get into that upper room. This Passover meal that they've been looking forward to for so long, that they've literally risked their lives to come and see. And they've just come through a period of people going, Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna. People are proclaiming Jesus the Messiah. They're in Jerusalem on Passover. I cannot stress what a big deal this would have been to them. The disciples would have been on cloud 9. They're thinking that Jesus is about to ascend to the throne, to the literal throne. They're thinking that something big and exciting is about to happen, and they're going to get to be a part of it. They finally get into that upper room, and they finally get Jesus all of themselves to celebrate Passover, to celebrate what they think is about to happen. And everything changes because Jesus finally stops talking about what's about to happen. And he stops talking about like the first shall be last and last will be first. And he stands up and he starts demonstrating this to them. He stands up, and it says he took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist. And when Jesus did this, those disciples would have panicked because they knew what he was about to do. They were so wrapped up in what was happening, they didn't even think to wash their own feet or get a servant to wash their feet, let alone wash one another's feet. At the moment that they were expecting him to stand up and proclaim himself Messiah, to proclaim himself King, he stands up and he puts a towel around his waist. Foot washing was common before a meal. These were people who'd been on a long journey, and they didn't walk around on sidewalks in Adidas Ultra Boosts. They walked on dirt roads in sandals. There were a lot of people in Jerusalem, obviously. What do you think the bathroom situation was like there? In the Old Testament, foot washing was something that was done to help purify the priests and prepare them to walk on holy ground. Washing feet and hands symbolized purity and forgiveness. And there was no way these men were going to let Jesus, the one that they thought they were going to see on a throne the next day, anywhere near their stinky, smelly, dirty, sin-filled feet. And in fact, Peter says this in John 13:8. He says, "No, you shall never wash my feet. You're not doing this." But he did. And washing feet is not a short process. Washing 12 sets of feet, it's going to take even longer. I think no one said a word after Peter settled down. I think all you could hear was the sound of the water gently moving in a bowl and the drips of the cloth as it was wrung and sort of wiped the feet. And I think they were completely humiliated because they knew what those hands could do. They knew what those hands were capable of. They had seen Jesus do things with his hands that were unbelievable, that were impossible. And there he was on his hands and knees, washing their feet. And when he finished, he washed his hands, he put his robes back on, and he said to them, and to me, and to you, if you're a Jesus follower, "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. And now that I, your Lord and your teacher, have washed your feet, you should also wash one another's feet. I have set an example that you should do as I have done for you." And then he restates what he said out on the road. "The Son of Man didn't come to serve, but be served. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a message greater," that's the wrong greater, I acknowledge that, "than the one who sent him." Jesus is taking away all of their excuses. He's saying, "Do you think you're better than me?" To which they would have replied, "No, sir." And now he is demonstrating to them that he is willing to do the most lowly job in the house. Foot washing was said to be a good career for widows. This was not a glamorous gig. He's saying, "I just served you as a servant." And he goes on and he says, "Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. In other words, when you're thinking that you're a big shot, you just go find some more feet to wash. And that's exactly what they did. The first century church put others first. It was so strong that it was appalling to the Roman Empire, who prized strength and winning and crushing things and all of that. It was so different than what was there. The idea that they would put other people first was appalling to them. The first century church would use their leverage to help others. They would use their power to empower people, and this was upside down. Although over time it became appealing and people flocked to this movement, to this Jesus movement. During the plagues in the Middle Ages, Christians had a higher survival rate because they took care of each other, because they cleaned each other when they were sick, and they brought each other food and water. It turns out there's a lot of illnesses you can recover from if you're just cared for while you're sick. The early church took in abandoned and exposed children. They had compassion and generosity. They served each other even when the people were sick, because Christians were not afraid of death, because they were following a leader who defeated death, that they saw it with their own eyes. They had a willingness to recognize the dignity and the equality of other people, and this was staggering, and it spread. How many of you know so much more about how airborne diseases spread than you did this time last week? Once something is in the air, starts to spread, there is almost no stopping it. Think about what we have done in our nation to stop the spread of this disease that we're fighting right now. Think about the things that we've given up, the extreme measures that we are taking to protect ourselves. It was Jesus' example and insistence on serving others that caused this movement that had no military, no authority, no territory, no sacred text to spread throughout the world, and eventually even be embraced by the very empire that set out to destroy it. And if you're a Christian, that's your story. Those are your people, the people on their hands and knees washing the feet of the people around them. And that's what I think we should do over the next 6 weeks. What would Plainfield look like if Tribe Church just stepped up and stepped out in the name of helping others? How would your neighborhood, how would your family look different if we started looking for opportunities to go last? If we stopped buying things that we don't need so that people who do need them can buy them? If we stopped hoarding and we started giving? What would it look like if we asked our spouse every morning for the next 45 days, what do you need most today, and then did it for them? What would it look like to take the time to have a conversation with our scared teenagers and college students and explain to them as best we can what's happening? What would it look like if we stopped freaking out for a little bit and played Candyland with our 5-year-old? What would it look like if we stepped out of our houses and actually met the people that we live next door to? What if we dug flower beds together? What if we raked someone's leaves that have made a mess over their yard over this winter? What if we bought something from a local business? What if we smiled at people in stores? What if we made those little free pantries that they have all over Plainfield that make sure that they are filled to the brim every day that this thing goes on? When it comes to your family, to your neighbors, to the people around you, especially now, we need to be asking this question right here the most. How can I help? I said at the beginning that we've seen a lot from our leaders. The leaders who are asking this question are the ones that we have respect for. They're the ones that we're following through this thing. This is an uncertain and scary time, and this is the question we need to be asking. How can I help? What can I do? How can I leverage me for you? And if you do, you will be like your Father in heaven, who looked down on our self-centered, me-first world and thought, what can I do for help? And then he sent his Son, not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life for a ransom for many. And to say, now go and do for others what I have done for you. Every week, we say the same thing. We say, love is the best thing that we do, and that's true. And please don't mistake the little rant that I just went on. I'm not asking you to put yourself in a situation that's not safe, but I'm saying there are lots of ways that we can serve each other and still stay safe ourselves. And to that end, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up, The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. As you head out in your week, please ask that question, how can I help? Please keep that in the front of your mind. And please remember that love is the best thing that we do.